Is it better to use high-speed sync or a neutral density filter to get that creamy, shallow depth of field in your portraits? I'm going to tell you on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey everybody, welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions. If you have photo questions, please go to askdavidbergman.com, fill out that form, send in your photo questions, and I just might answer it here on a future show. If it's a very specific question just for like your piece of gear or your situation, I also offer one-on-one consultations over Zoom. You can check that out as well at Ask David Bergman. Also, you're already here on the Adorama TV YouTube channel. I hope you're a subscriber. If not, go ahead and click that button down below. Use the little bell icon so you get notifications of all the latest and greatest photo shows as soon as they come out, pretty much every day of the week, right here for free on Adorama TV. Today's question was sent in by Stacey C, and she wants to know, I know that I can use high-speed sync on my flash to get a shallow depth of field, but I've also read that a neutral density filter can accomplish the same thing. Why would I use one or the other? So what are we talking about here? Well, when we refer to shooting with a shallow depth of field, we're really talking about opening your lens up as wide as possible. Now, specifically when shooting portraits, a lot of times it's a really nice look to have the background be out of focus. It turns into like this creamy, smooth background, and it really makes your subject pop off of the image. And that's the look you oftentimes want when you're shooting a portrait. So the way you accomplish that is you have to have a lens that will open very wide, and that's usually more expensive lenses are going to allow wider apertures, although some primes like a nifty 50 are relatively inexpensive and can allow you to go as low as 1.8, 1.4, 1.2. Those low numbers, even if you have a lens that's 2.8, that's going to give you a nice shallow depth of field, because the wider you can open that lens, the way the optics work is it's going to create what we call a shallow depth of field. So if you're focused on somebody's face, the depth of field is how far before the background starts to go out of focus. And the background and the foreground are going to go more out of focus away from your focus plane. So in this case, it would be the face. So if you're shooting at a closed down aperture like f8 or f11, something like that, that background is going to be much more in focus and could be distracting to your subject. Whereas if you could open up to 2.8, 2.0, 1.4, 1.2, something like that, you're really going to throw that background more out of focus. It's going to have a soft, creamy quality. We refer to that as bokeh, and it's really nice to get that kind of a look on a portrait. Now, here's the issue. In bright daylight, even if you're at your lowest ISO that your camera will go 100 or 200, usually what you're going to have to do, because your aperture, your lens is open so wide and letting a lot of light in, you're going to have to compensate your exposure by speeding up your shutter speed. That's the only way to prevent too much light from coming in. So when you add flash into the equation, it adds an extra challenge, because you're dealing with every camera has every 35 millimeter DSLR. There are different kinds of cameras, but most cameras that you're going to be using, that we're all using, have what we call a max sync speed. And what that means is a max flash sync speed. What that means is that the flash, you can only use a shutter speed up to a certain point, because the way flash works, traditional flash works, is so the shutter opens and the shutter closes, right? I'm oversimplifying a bit, but when the shutter's open, that's when the sensor is being exposed. And the flash pops, right? It's going to go on and off. Again, I'm oversimplifying. It's a little more complicated than that, but basically that flash has to go on and off all within the time that the shutter is open and exposing that sensor. If it's longer, if the flash is on longer, then some of that's going to get cut off, and you might see a black bar or a shadow where that flash got cut off. So most cameras actually won't let you, when you have a flash attached, won't let you go faster than the camera's sync speed. It's usually around 125, 200, 250 of a second, something like that. It depends on the camera. So, like I said now, when you add flash to those outdoor photographs, you're going to have an issue, because you can't speed up your shutter any faster than, in my case, with something like the Canon 1DX Mark III, that's going to be 2/50th of a second. So I wanted to play around with this and figure out how to solve this. So I took my mannequin and I brought her into the studio here. It's an overcast day in New York City. I really wanted to go outside in bright daylight, but I'm going to simulate daylight by raising my ISO up to 6400 here in the studio. So you just have to play along with me and imagine we're outdoors and shooting at 100 ISO. It's still going to, be the same concept. What I did was also I hung a photograph right behind the mannequin. It's about 1 foot, 12 inches or so behind the mannequin, so that we could create some depth of field. And I added in the Speedlite. I'm just using a simple Canon Speedlite 600 EXRT. I know these aren't good pictures, but don't hold it against me. I'm just demonstrating the concept. So stay with me here. All right. So now, if I'm shooting with a flash outdoors, wink, wink, on a bright sunny day, remember I can't go higher than 2/50th of a second when using regular flash. So the exposure here in this frame is 2/50th of a second, my max sync speed at f8. My flash is at 128th power, but if we were really outdoors, it might be at a quarter power or a half power or something like that, maybe even higher. So you can see at f8 how much of that background is actually in focus. Now I'm using one of my favorite portrait lenses, the 85 1.4. It's a beautiful portrait lens, and I want to take advantage of the fact that I can shoot at 1.4. If I change my aperture and open up to 1.4, that's opening up 5 stops from f8. If you calculate it, it's f8, so to 5, 6, 4, 2.8, 2.0, and then 1.4. That's 5 full stops while leaving my shutter speed at 2/50th of a second. Now, by just doing that, the ambient light outdoors, of course, is going to overpower the scene, and it's just way too bright. So there are 2 ways to solve this problem, as Stacey asked. First of all, the first one is by using high-speed sync. This is kind of a newish technology that's built into many flash systems now and allows you to set your camera faster than its maximum flash sync. It's built in definitely to like the Canon system, the Nikon system, Sony system. They all have that built in with their own flashes. Again, I'm using the 600 EXRT here, but it's also available in third-party strobes as well, big studio strobes, portable battery-powered strobes. Sometimes they offer 2 versions, one with high-speed sync and one without. It's sort of an upgrade, but it's much more common now in third-party strobes as well. And the way high-speed sync works, instead of being one burst of light like a normal flash, it actually pulses the light. So it kind of starts before the shutter opens and just pulses through and then ends after the shutter is closed. So it's almost like a constant light. It's like it essentially is a light that's always on. So that way you can use faster shutter speeds and still have flash in the photograph, right? So it's very simple to do. You just turn on high-speed sync on your camera or on your flash, and it's all of a sudden now gonna let you go above your max sync speed. Now, back with my mannequin, I set that up, and I'm now at 8,000th of a second with my aperture wide open at 1.4. Now, because high-speed sync uses more flash power, because it's not just one burst of flash, it's a bunch of smaller bursts, that image is going to be really underexposed at the same flash power that I was using before. So I raised up the flash power on my flash in 1-stop increments until I got it looking how I wanted it, how it looked before. Now here it is again when I raised it 1 stop, then 2 stops, and then 3 stops. That works for me and looks pretty good. So that's how I would do it with high-speed sync. Now, Stacey, you asked about using a neutral density filter instead, and that's absolutely another way to go. An ND filter is kind of like sunglasses for your lens, where it blocks some of the light from entering. You can buy them in different power levels depending on how many stops you want to block, and they're labeled usually as 0.3 per stop. So a 0.3 ND filter blocks 1 stop of light, 0.6 blocks 2 stops, 0.9 blocks 3 stops, and so on. A 3.0 actually blocks 10 stops of light. Now, if you just get a standard one that screws on the front of your lens, all you need to do is just buy the right size to match the filter thread on that lens. If you think you're going to use this with more than one lens, you want to buy the lens, buy the filter for the biggest lens you have, the biggest diameter. Maybe it's 77 millimeters or 82 millimeters. And then you can get just inexpensive step-up rings to put on the other lenses. So you can use that same filter across various lenses. Now, the low-power ND filters like 1, 2, and 3 stops are really pretty cheap, usually around $30. You can also get a variable ND like this one. Where is it? Here it is. Like this one that I've used for this shoot. After it's on the lens, you actually can just turn it to change the amount of light it's going to block. Now, this particular one is from a company called Syrp, and it's a 1 to 8.5 stops. So I can adjust that by just turning this and making it darker and lighter as I need. And this particular one comes in a kit with a nice little case, and it has actually step-up rings. It comes with 2 or 3 step-up rings. I've got the 77 millimeter on here already. So that's kind of a nice system that I always have in my bag. Now, If I want to go that route with my outdoor portrait, I'm going to simply put my settings back to how they were at the beginning when I was using normal flash, not high-speed sync. So that's 2/50th of a second at f8, and my flash is back down to 128th power. Now, by adding that variable ND and dialing it down 5 stops, I can open up my aperture 5 stops to compensate, giving me that 1.4 and that nice shallow depth of field. So I can't even see Craig Krenzel back there in the background, right? So looking at the two images at 1.4, they're pretty much the same. So, Stacey, you asked, why would you choose one or the other? Well, high-speed sync is easy. If you just turn it on, very, very simple to activate. It's also probably already built into your flash, so you don't have to buy anything else. But the knock on high-speed sync is that it eats batteries. I had to raise my flash power 3 stops to get the same amount of light from my flash when I went to 8,000th of a second. In this case, I'm only at 16th power on my flash, but remember, in daylight, I might be at full power by now, or maybe even can't get enough power out of a Speedlite. So since it's much brighter out there and I want to match that ambient light, that's where I'm going to have to get that balance. Now, because I'm using more power, my recycle time is going to be slower, which means more time between pops. That could be awkward in a shoot if you're, with a person and you're trying to keep shooting and you have to wait for the flash to recycle. And also, of course, the batteries are going to die faster. You can have, with a Speedlite, you can have extra AA batteries with you, but also if you're using a big power pack on a studio strobe, you have to make sure you have another one of those or you'll have to stop and recharge. So instead of raising the power, you can also bring your flash in much closer, but that's going to change the look of your image and you might not be something that you want to do. Now, what about the ND filter? Well, you're not going to have that power problem. You don't have to switch to that pulsing light of high-speed sync. With my demo shoot, I've got 3 extra stops of light as opposed to shooting with high-speed sync. So I've got no worries about batteries dying or recycle time slowing down. But it's an extra piece of equipment that you have to buy and make sure you have in your camera bag when you need it. And it just takes a minute to put on if you're and if you're using a variable ND, which is way more convenient because you can dial in exactly what you want, it might take some trial and error to get the right amount of light blocking that you need. So which one's for you? Well, before high-speed sync was an option, ND filters were the only way to get a nice shallow depth of field when shooting a portrait and flash outdoors. Now, high-speed sync has made it really easy to quickly open up your aperture and get that smooth out-of-focus background. What I'd say is that if you're not going to do this often, just pop into high-speed sync mode when you need it. The battery issue can be a real problem, though, so make sure you have extra batteries charged and ready to go. If you shoot this type of image a lot, I'd say neutral density, buying a neutral density filter is a good investment, especially if you're using a mirrorless camera. In the old days when you were shooting optically, it was really hard to see through the lens once you had that dark filter over it. Now with a mirrorless, it compensates for it in the viewfinder, so it's not so much of an issue. Remember, ND filters have other uses too. They allow you to shoot long exposures in daylight, so you can make cool images of water flowing and things like that. This is my picture from Niagara Falls using an ND filter with a very long exposure. So I hope that clears things up and helps you decide what's best for you. There's no substitute for just going out and trying. I know this can be a little bit confusing, so shoot for yourself and see how this all works. Hopefully, you've got more sunlight wherever you are as opposed to me here in New York City. So Stacey, thanks for asking that question. Remember, you guys, if you have your own photo questions, please go ahead and send them in to askdavidbergman.com. Also, like and comment on this video. I'm back here every week, Monday morning, 10 a.m. Eastern with a brand new episode. I hope you'll join me right here on Ask David Bergman.